weeks ago, a number of events came together that really prompted me to pursue a deeper dive into the concept of anger and really its role in both destroying things, but also its place in the process of healing. I considered this a God showing his face moment, or as we've described in Sophia, a Texas moment. And you that are not familiar with that phrase, just speak to someone on your right or left that was around when we first came through. They'll tell you what Texas moments are. Anyways, what I want to do is just quickly list the series of events that occurred over really almost a week and a half that showed God moving in a direction that I want to speak about today. So we have a weekly Bible study, and in this Bible study, about 8 or 9 of us discussed at length the passages found in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus really speaks towards anger, reconciliation, the verses that talk about leaving your gifts at the altar and reconciling with another person that has an issue with you. In that same passage, he states that murder is not just an outward act, but the manifestation of, bitterness or anger, which emanates from one's heart. The second thing that happened was a relative of mine contacted me she's out of state, really to vent her anger issues based on a dysfunction between her 2 siblings. Despite my angst on this, or pleas for her to do whatever it takes to change this or reconcile, she was not in the frame of mind to release that anger. So it just festered, and you could see the extreme bitterness and hurt that was happening in her world. The third thing that happened was a good friend of mine suggested a podcast that really wasn't spiritually based, but had concepts that resonated with biblical themes. This author was interviewed regarding a book she wrote speaking about the American justice system and how a restorative methodology might reclaim the lives of both the perpetrators and also bring justice and satisfaction to the victim and their families. She herself needed healing from traumatic childhood where her father sexually and emotionally abused her. She went to the extent of traveling to Tibet. If you remember, Tibet it was basically overtaken by China, and wanted to speak to those who were present at that time to see how they processed their disappointment and their anger at the situation. And somehow in all these issues, she got a 1-hour audience with Dalai Lama. Very difficult to get. The Dalai Lama said something that really resonated. He asked her, really in a non-condescending way, whether she had sat in her anger long enough. Very interesting. He viewed anger as needing an endpoint, but he also valued the process of healing that it provided. So the fourth thing is that Mikhail and I have charted reading the Bible in a year. And by chance, I was reading Job during this time and was taken by the 37 or 38 chapters of discussion regarding God's nature, most of it defining all the details of Job's current terrible situation that he was in, where Job is in a complaining mode. He's in an anger mode. His friends are dissing and possibly defaming who God is. We see that later at the end of the book. And at the end, God finally speaks, yet we see that God allowed this process. He allowed 37, 38 chapters to occur before he really gets involved in the discussion. And then the fifth thing is, out of all these things coming together, I also studied a 10-part series in Aleph Beta where the Rabbi David Foreman discussed in depth the concept of when it was kosher to argue with God. So many of the nuances today, especially the Hebrew grammar, I'll introduce, comes from really the lessons and the expertise that he produced. So all these elements came together in the course of really 1.5 weeks. And I do believe the Spirit of God was working to nudge me in a direction to go deeper, really into the good, the bad, and the ugly regarding this concept of anger. This might be a topic that needs tackling over a number of presentations. I don't know yet. But today, all I want to do is briefly summarize some New Testament passages that speak to this tension of anger's place in our lives. Then I want to look at an Old Testament scenario at Hannah. She's the mother of Samuel, and how she channeled her anger and disappointment with God into something that brought peace and resolution ultimately. Okay, so first, let's look at the New Testament. So in Mark 3 and Romans 2, we see Jesus and the Father expressing anger, especially towards those who are stubborn, those who promote selfishness, who reject the truth, and who follow evil. In 1 Corinthians 13, we're told through Paul that love is not easily angered. So it doesn't state that anger doesn't surface, it's just not easily angered. Paul later speaks to the Ephesians to really harness their anger and not sin while they're angry. He also speaks of eventually them eliminating the anger when he states the phrase of not letting the sun go down while they're on their anger. You know, I just do want to mention on a side note that we got to be careful not to assign a chronological amount of time to process this emotion. You know, is it literally one 24-hour period, or is Paul speaking in other terms? We just need to finish it at some point, but I think we do more harm by forcing people into this 24-hour period where they haven't processed it well enough. So bottom line, there needs to be a finish to the end of anger, but I do think it serves its purpose as a catalyst. So a catalyst is something that stirs some sort of chemical explosion or something within our bodies. So a catalyst for what we might ask. So maybe the catalyst for anger would be for creating honesty with God or with others, allowing them to see the depth of hurt or disappointment that you're feeling at that moment. So anger can work in that method. Anger can allow for the proper outlet for healing. It's a beginning. But like a catalyst, it's not to remain the primary driving force for day-to-day rhythms. Much like a defibrillator. They place these on heart attack victims' chest, and they shock them to get their heart restarted and get them back into rhythm. But the expectation is not to use these continuously. Otherwise, that would do really irreparable harm and kill them. Now to Hannah. So like so many women mentioned in the scripture, she was barren, and she desperately wanted a child. So let's read a little bit in 1 Samuel 1 regarding her dilemma, what prompted her discomfort, and what she prayed to God, displaying her raw honesty and hurt and her disappointment and her anger, and why God let her process this with and allowed her to communicate in this way to him. It's sort of bridging the gap of, am I going too far with God? Because of the passage's length, I'm going to summarize the cast of characters and a little bit of the narrative. Then I'm going to read her actual prayer that's found in verses 11 through 18 in 1 Samuel chapter 1. So the main characters are Elkanah, that's Hannah's husband, Hannah, and one other wife, Peninnah. So already we see there could be problems here. Get two wives. Peninnah bore many children. Hannah was barren. Yearly, they went to Shiloh to offer sacrifices. One year, Elkanah, because of his love and concern for Hannah, gave her a double portion of meat to eat, while only giving the other wife and her children single portions. This incident set Peninnah off in a rage, and from then on, yearly, she tormented Hannah because of her barrenness. So Hannah responds in depth in prayer. That's what we see. Then Eli, who's present, he's the priest, confronts her as being drunk. After the prayer, she leaves content. She's not downcast. Later, she and Elkanah have sexual relations, and she becomes pregnant, later bearing her child Samuel. So let's read her prayer. Hannah stood up. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. As she kept on praying to the Lord, Eli observed her mouth. Hannah was praying in her heart, and her lips were moving, but her voice was not heard. Eli thought she was drunk, and he said to her, "How long are you going to stay drunk? Put away your wine." "Not so, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. Do not take your servant for a wicked woman. I have been praying here out of my great anguish and grief." Eli answered her, "Then go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant you what you have asked him." She said, "May your servant find favor in your eyes." Then she went on her way, ate something, and her face was no longer downcast. And then later it states that she becomes pregnant and gives birth to Samuel. So a few questions. What prompted Hannah's anger and complaint? And similarly, what was her state of emotion? What was her posture toward God in prayer as she voiced her displeasure at the state of her barrenness? And what ultimately brought her solace where she could put her anger and complaint to bed, so to speak? So what was the catalyst for Hannah to approach God with this prayer? The ancients noticed that a seldom used phrase really illustrated the trigger for her anger, really for her complaint. Our English translations miss the emphasis placed on that triggering moment by translating verse 4, "and when the day came." That's the day that all the drama began between the two wives. The Hebrew, though, is much more emphatic that it was a monumental day by stating, "and it occurred on that day." It may seem minor or insignificant, but these Jewish sages saw this as a catalyst for really the entire narrative. Prior it was just business as usual. Hannah, still barren, yearly accompanied her family to Shiloh. However, one day, one specific day, it all changed. Isn't that also really what happens in moments of our own anger? We can point to one specific moment when something occurred which changed the direction of our interaction with either an individual or a group or even with ourselves. We also, we can also get angry and bitter over our own actions, and our bitterness is directed at ourselves. As an example, to this day, I continually have to forgive myself for my immature, self-serving way in which I treated relationships throughout high school and college. Those relationships were really there to satisfy me and my needs and my wants. But honestly, those moments also were catalysts for me seeking God's forgiveness. Think of moments that may have produced anger in your own life. Maybe it was an adversary like Hannah had with the other wife. Maybe it was a situation at work, getting overlooked for a promotion. Maybe a health ailment that is persistent, or the loss of a friend or family member, or maybe a church cause hurt. Maybe you've been marginalized in your opinions and feel that you don't matter, you're not heard. We all have these catalysts that initiate this raw emotion of anger or disappointment. What are indications that Hannah was in deep despair regarding her situation? The Hebrew captures this by doubling the verbs used by Hannah and the narrator describing her situation. Our English translations, they don't capture this because it reads kind of awkwardly. For example, in verse 6, it doesn't simply say that Peninnah makes her angry. It says, "She makes me angry, she makes me angry." And in verse 10, the Hebrew states, "She cried, yes, she cried." And later in Hannah's prayer, she says to God, "If indeed you look, if indeed you will look." So the Hebrew writers, I believe they were deliberate in using these duplicate verbs really to enhance the action or the emotion felt by Hannah. You can see this, for example, over in Ezekiel chapter 13, verse 18, where the scripture is translated, "Surely you will die." That's how we read it. But its raw form says, "Die, yes, die." There actually is no Hebrew word for the word surely. Okay, enough translational geekdom here. The doubling of verbs, though, in Hannah's story just is a point of emphasis about how deeply this situation was affecting her. We also get a glimpse of Hannah's state of turmoil when we see her response to Eli after he accuses her of being drunk. she makes a seemingly innocuous statement in verse 16. She says, "Do not take your servant as a wicked woman." Wicked woman in the Hebrew is a term of a person associated with idol worship and comes from the root without burden. I believe Hannah recognized that Eli might confuse her, this passion that she had, as being very similar to those engaged in idol worship. But regardless, it does clue us in to the passion in which she prayed, as if she was praying without burden. We might say that she was unfiltered, or speaking her mind and emotions, or being real. Eli, seeing her as drunk, might relate to how someone in that state of inebriation is unhindered in their speech. So the Hebrew states that Hannah had been speaking to God out of the abundance of her complaint and grief. She was bothered by how God had let this situation transpire. It's interesting that her anger is directed towards Yahweh and not towards Peninnah. We can see the courage or the chutzpah, or some say the guts, that she displays in verse 10, where most translations speak of Hannah praying to God, whereas the Hebrew word for to is el, and it doesn't show up here. The preposition that's used here is al or al, and that means on or upon. So the translation actually reads that Hannah was praying upon God or on God. So the essence here is that Hannah was brazen in her prayer. She was lodging a complaint against God. We need to also notice that Hannah did not cross a line in speaking her heart to God. She was in control. You see this again by the simple preposition that we just mentioned, the translation of el, which literally means on or upon. So verse 13, where the scripture states Hannah was praying in her heart, really the appropriate tense suggests that Hannah was praying on her heart. So the English translators, they really deemed this as odd and it didn't make sense, so they changed it. But I do believe that the Hebrew writers were being deliberate in their choice of words. A note, these sages of ancient times noticed that the phrases that indicate those processing issues in their heart tended to be those of bad character, and those who were described as processing issues of their heart, on their heart, tended to be people of righteous character. So the imagery suggested that the heart was not the driving the emotional train here. Rather, they were speaking outside of their heart, in essence, directing their heart on how they should respond. So the on their heart folks had control of their anger, while the in their heart folks let their heart control their emotions, rule their behavior and attitudes. And we need to pay attention to this. As we talk about the proper place for anger, Hannah understood this. She wasn't out of control. She wasn't just triggered and flipping out. We don't have the right to do that, to go and just be, we'll cause people to be gun shy around us because they don't know what's going to set us off. And I believe in that state, we are processing things in our heart. We're letting our heart have our emotions explode. And that is not the space, I think, of an anger that's talked about here with Hannah. So in summary, Hannah didn't cross that line with God. Even in her anger, she was not consumed with this anger. Her anger came from a very rational place. So the outcome of this story is that she left that prayer with her face no longer downcast. We would expect her demeanor to change only after she realized that she had gotten pregnant. But in verse 18, it says that she simply went on her way, she ate, and she no longer looked despondent. What was satisfying to her? You think about it, she was probably satisfied with the process of being in real communication with her Creator. She held nothing back. She felt heard. Her demeanor was not outcome-based, but was relationally based. I think about my mom, for instance. When she was alive, she would call my office almost daily to talk. And at that time, I sort of am ashamed to say, but those talks felt very repetitive. I mean, how much added information can be discussed every day or every other day? But what I came to understand, though, is that communication that I was looking for is just to give information. Perhaps my mom was looking just for relational aspect of it, just to communicate. I later realized the value of those conversations before she died when a friend at work pointed out that there'd be a day that I no longer hear her voice. And it is true. I don't want to make a blanket gender-based statement, but there's something intrinsic within men and women which drives how communication really satisfies us. One is based on outcome, the other may be being based on just being heard. A few extra thoughts really before I close out. I do believe anger that is controlled is difficult to do. It's easier said than done. The place where we start dealing with whatever issue has prompted that emotion, it's not an easy, it's a messy thing. But anger can really be initially beneficial, but it can't take the place and sit there long term with us. It needs to be so-called put to bed so it doesn't escalate into things like bitterness. You look at Cain, for instance. God said to Cain after he recognized Cain's anger to do the right thing because sin was crouching at his door. So the anger wasn't the sin, it was how he was going to process that emotion in his heart and actions. Anger becomes sin when it becomes our default response towards anything that disappoints us. And so finally, I believe God wants us to see the reality of our thoughts as we express them. We can be conflict avoiders, not only with each other, but with God as well. Jesus in Matthew 7 stated, "Many will say to me on that day, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out demons, and in your name perform many miracles?' Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers." He says, I never knew you. Are we truly honest in our conversations with him? We have to ask ourselves. Also, we need to be really cognizant as we get real and as we're very expressive, not to cross a line and to demean God's character in our anger or with our complaints towards him. If you read towards the end of Job, God states that Job's three friends were in the wrong because they presented God inaccurately in their arguments back and forth with Job. Hannah was not speaking out of the heart, but upon her heart. She dictated the conversation towards God, and in so doing was heard by him. Thanks for your time.